What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. All right, so it was yesterday that the news broke that Democratic nominee, she's already been formally nominated before the convention, um, but Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris announced that her VP pick is none other than Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. And while Tim Walz does have liberal leanings, um, his look, um, his lineage probably will have some appeal toward undecided voters, um, and perhaps some moderate conservatives and disgruntled Republican voters. That's the hope here. That's the hope for the Democratic Party. All right. He did 24 years in the armed services. He served in the Army. I think he reached the rank of Commander Sergeant, I think it was. He was a teacher. That was one of the reasons why Josh Shapiro wasn't ultimately picked, because of his support of private, support of private schools and vouchers for private schools and education. So he was not a fan, a personal favorite of those teachers unions, those who advocate public schooling, et cetera, et cetera. Also, as I said before, Shapiro was an avid, and although he tried to distance himself lately from that, an avid supporter of Israel and the whole Israel-Palestine thing. In states like Michigan, states like Wisconsin, they have a proportionally, Minnesota as well, especially Minnesota and Michigan, they have a proportionally high Muslim population. And you don't want to piss them off, because there can be a difference between Trump and Kamala carrying those states. And Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, combined, they have I think 35 electoral votes. And that'll be pivotal in a close election. Pivotal, swinging one way or the other. Also, I read that Josh Shapiro didn't really interview well, and that he seemed reluctant to leave his job as governor of Pennsylvania. So on the surface, Tim Walz it seemed like a good pick. He's good on the stump. I know that. He's really, really good on the stump. But this is something that I've been wanting to ask, because I didn't really get into this yesterday. Now, 4 years ago, Joe Biden picked Kamala Harris, right? And we saw that for what it was. He was appeasing Black women because they had been the most loyal constituent of the Democratic Party. Now, remember, the Democratic Party already had selected a woman for vice president. They already broke that ground back in '84 with Walter Mondale. Okay? So it had already been done. And they'd already had a woman on the ticket, at the top of the ticket in 2016 with Hillary Clinton. So that had already been done. So Black women almost demanded to Joe Biden that he pick a woman, quote unquote, of color. I thought the better pick would have been Gretchen Whitmer. But ultimately, he selected Kamala Harris, who seemed to have a change of heart, considering that 6 months earlier, she was pillaring Joe Biden for supporting segregation back in the 70s. You know what I'm saying? It was against public busing and so forth. But you know, the thing was, people said that this was, I guess the term you use now is a DEI hire. Kamala Harris, you know, she checks certain boxes. She's not qualified, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Only selecting her because of race to appease a certain demographic or appease a certain group of voters. Okay, well then why the people aren't saying this about Tim Walz? Because it's quite obvious. If you looked at his introduction in Philadelphia yesterday, it's almost, when you listen to him talk, it almost was like he was running for president and she was vice president. He had to be the dominant force in the room. Am I the only one that felt that? Am I the only one that felt like it was like he should be the top of the ticket and she should be at the bottom? And we all knew she was going to pick a male, a white male. She couldn't pick another woman because that would have sent the covert racists in the Democratic Party into a tizzy. She definitely couldn't pick a black woman or a black woman of color, or excuse me, a black woman or a woman of color. It couldn't be a black male. That ticket wouldn't quite have the right hue for the covert racists in the Democratic Party. So to appease the majority of the Democrats out there, she had to pick a white male. I think she wanted to get Shapiro. But I think what ultimately happened, matter of fact, it was almost leaked. It was leaked pretty much that Shapiro was going to be the guy. But I think what happened was, and I hate to say this, the thought of a so-called black woman and a small hat on the ticket would have been too much for some people. They're not going to say it, but I think that has something to do with it, unfortunately. So she went with Tim Walz. I mean, you can see it. You know, he comes across as the typical Midwestern, you know, dude who can appease certain voters. You know what I'm saying? Now, whether or not you find his policies a little bit too left, that's to be determined. But he gives you the aura of a regular guy. He gives you the perception. Even if you looked at a picture of Tim Walz, you would think he was Republican. He just has that look. So that's the hope. Now, look, do vice presidential picks help the ticket? Not as much as it used to. What it's really about, what the ticket is really about, honestly, is consolidating the party more than anything else. Now, sometimes the VP pick will help you win a state or win an election. I think the most effective modern VP pick was Lyndon Johnson, because there's no doubt about it, Lyndon Johnson being on the ticket with Kennedy, who was very weak in the South, especially Texas, which was why, by the way, Kennedy was in Dallas when he had his rendezvous with death in 1963 in November. He was in Texas because he was very unpopular there. While at the time Kennedy had an approval rating nationally of 56%, he only had 39% approval rating in Texas. And Texas was going to be pivotal. But it was, but Lyndon Johnson helped Kennedy carry Texas. Kennedy still only won Texas by about 40,000 votes. That was because of Lyndon Johnson's presence on the ticket. Lyndon Johnson helped Kennedy carry some other southern states by narrow margins. South Carolina being one. Also, Edmund Muskie being on a ticket, although it was a losing one for Hubert Humphrey in 1968, Edmund Muskie, helped Humphrey carry Maine against Richard Nixon. Now, back in those days, Maine was a Republican state. New England was a Republican state back when the New England was Republican. Now, I know that sounds crazy, but the Republican Party had a bigger tent back then, and they were more conservative back then. The northern Republican members they were more pocketbook Republicans. They believed in, low taxes, government staying out of people's lives, et cetera, et cetera. But they were not social issues conservatives. And that's what eventually turned off many northern Yankee Republicans from the Republican Party, was the marriage between the Republicans and the Christian Coalition in the late 80s, the Reagan Revolution, that started turning them off. That's why the last time any Republican had any success in New England was Bush in 88. And even then, he underperformed from prior Republicans. But sometimes the VP pick can help. Gore helped Clinton a little bit in the South. He helped Clinton carry Tennessee narrowly twice in 92 and 96. But increasingly, the VP pick doesn't really help that much in elections. Although I suspect Tim Walz may help her a little bit. I think it's going to be pretty much relegated to the the Midwest and Rust Belt area. But I think more or less it's to consolidate the ticket, the party behind the ticket. That's what I think the VP pick is important. That's pretty much what it was. Remember, in 1944, FDR had to drop Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace had ran with him in 1940, but he was dropped in 44 because many in the Democratic Party, especially the South, the Dixiecrats, didn't want Henry Wallace on the ticket. And I'll tell you why. Because they knew it was rumors that FDR was sick. And they knew that there was a chance that FDR could die in office, which ultimately he did the very next year. They didn't want Henry Wallace to be president. Why? Because Henry Wallace was extremely left-wing. I contend that the Roosevelt-Wallace ticket was the most liberal ticket in history. Remember, Henry Wallace left the Democratic Party and ran it as a socialist with communist Soviet sympathizer. He was a Soviet Union sympathizer. He became a socialist. He ran as a socialist in 1948, got over 1 million votes. So that guy could have been president had he been renominated in 1944. He would have been president of the United States. Instead, he was dropped from the ticket, and a then little-known senator named Harry Truman from Missouri was selected. He didn't want to be on the ticket, by the way. He didn't want to leave his job as United States Senator, but FDR and the Democratic Party elites forced him. They pretty much forced him, using, the duty of your country and all of that stuff. And he reluctantly agreed to be on the ticket, became VP, was miserable as VP for 82 days until FDR keeled over in Warm Springs, Georgia in April 1945. But anyway, enough history lesson. Tell me what you guys think, man. Like, why people aren't calling him a DEI hire?